Hello and welcome to this QuizCon webinar. My name is Peter Baddeley and the topic for today's webinar is Common Business Scenarios Connecting SharePoint and MS Graph API. We're going to be looking at the various apps which QuizCon offer around connecting to data, and that can be data stored in SharePoint, Excel, but also the Microsoft Graph API. We're going to be looking at the different apps which are available, and then also looking at how all of those apps are available within the single Data View Plus. Now I'm going to start with a few slides today just to introduce what I'm talking about, and then we'll go through a series of demos demonstrating each of the apps, showing you some of the different capabilities available. And then, as Sarah says, at the end of the session, we'll go through any questions. If you've got any questions as we go through, feel free to put those into chat and we'll follow all through those at the end of the webinar. Okay, so just to introduce QuizCon's data view tools for SharePoint Online and Office 365. They're basically a set of SPFX web parts that can be used for various data retrieval and presentation mechanisms. And overall, they sit within the Data View Plus app. So Data View Plus app is the app which contains all of the different apps which I'm going to show you today, but they're also available individually as well if you need them only a certain app to solve a specific problem. So we're going to look at the List View Plus, the Aggregator, the Org Chart, and the Calendar today. And just a bit of sort of background about how they work. So the apps can connect to various data sources, either within SharePoint or Excel files or out to the Microsoft Graph. And then we can manipulate that data and present it in whatever format we like. We sort of call it a bit like the Lego style UI because it's all about building up different bricks to control what columns of information are displayed, how that's grouped, how that's filtered, how that's searchable, conditional formatting as well. It gives you so much more flexibility than the standard SharePoint list web parts, and we can also use that capability with other sorts of data as well. So just to introduce each of the apps, and we'll go through all of the apps in turn on slides first, and then we'll go into the demo and look at each of these apps. So firstly, I'll be showing you the List View Plus app. So that's basically around connecting to SharePoint list data, either within the current site or a remote site, so another sub-site or another site collection, and then being able to manipulate how that data is presented in many different ways using this sort of Lego style building UI. So adding filters, adding groups, adding conditional formats as well. We can also add various actions to each item in the list as well. So being able to view the item, edit the item, but then do more, such as link off to open a map or another service as well. Next, I'll have a look at List Aggregator. So List Aggregator is similar to the List View Plus app. It's got all those same options around how we present data, but it's about dealing with multiple data sources instead of a single data source. So that could be multiple SharePoint lists, either within the same site or different sites. So I'm going to demonstrate an example of rolling up multiple task lists. But with the list aggregator, we're not also limited to SharePoint list data. We can leverage the SharePoint search if you want to look across many lists, across many site collections. And we can also connect to the Graph API as well to look at data in various different data sources across Office 365. Then we'll have a look at the Calendar Plus. So the Calendar Plus is similar to the previous apps. It's got all those same controls, but it's about calendar specific data. So we could connect to calendars within SharePoint, or in my case, I'm going to demonstrate connecting to an Outlook Exchange calendar. And we can even do aggregation here. So we could even take multiple different calendars and aggregate them into a single calendar and present them in a much richer way than the standard events web part or the mail calendar web parts, which are available natively. Next is probably my favorite of the apps, which is the Org Chart app. So universally, every organization needs to display org chart data in SharePoint. And so we're going to have a look at the org chart. Again, we can connect to SharePoint list data, but I'm going to demonstrate connecting to data in my Active Directory using the Graph API. I'm going to show you how we can customize this org chart, some of the different layouts available, but also things like making individual highlights of specific elements of the org chart, managing assistants, and other presentational elements, as well as doing things like searches across that org chart as well. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the Data View Plus. Everything's building up to the Data View Plus app. It's a bit like a Swiss Army knife. It's the combination of all these different apps. So everything else I'm going to demonstrate to you is available within the Data View Plus app. It can connect to all of the different data sources, SharePoint, Excel, the graph. It can aggregate data. And on top of all of those things, it also introduces something called custom controls. So if we want to present data in a very specific way, we can do that as well using the Data View Plus app, and I'll show you that as well in the demo. Okay, so switching over to SharePoint. So I'm just logged into a SharePoint site here. It's a modern SharePoint site because obviously I'm using SPFX web parts here. And I've got 5 different pages set up just to demonstrate the different examples, which I'm going to go through with you today. So let's start with the List View Plus app. So here we can see it. I've got my List View Plus app on the page. This is actually connecting to a SharePoint list within my current site. It could be into a separate site, so the app supports connecting to other sites as well. So I've got a SharePoint list here, just a list of suppliers with some various metadata fields available to me. So let's have a look at this app and look at some of the features which this gives me. You can see that the data is immediately grouped, so I can expand or collapse specific groups if I want to. There's options to select various items within my list. And I've got export options at the top here to either export everything or just to export selected items out to a CSV file. At the top here, I've configured search, so I can search across anything within my list, or I can choose to search for specific columns. So I can, in this case, I'm searching on the supplier type, so I could type here, or I could select from the various options to say, well, I'm only interested in raw material suppliers, for example, and that will immediately filter down the list of information. I can clear that filter and I see all items. Other things which we've got going on here, we've got some conditional formatting. So you see the little red icon and the supplier types highlighted in red, so highlighting any which are in transportation. And then to the right of the menu of the items here, I've got some various actions available to me. For instance, to view the item properties in a pop-out, or I've also configured it to show a map. So in this case, showing a Google map of the specific city. So there's one connecting to Toronto, and then we'll have a look at another one which is connecting to New York. As a user, I can also manipulate what's on screen for me to create an experience a bit more personalized to me as an individual around this list. So at the moment, we're grouping by whether they're approved or not. But I can go, well, actually, I'm more interested in grouping those by city. And that immediately manipulates the view on screen for me. And I can choose to save that filter for me as the current user using this app. If I was an administrator, I could make those changes and then save them for all of users as well. I can also take a specific field. Let's say I took status, and I can drag it up to the filter pane at the top here to actually have additional search options available to me. So there's a number of bits of configuration an individual user can do, and they're super quick, and it's all just drag and drop, very simple. But also, I can configure this whole app in less than 2 minutes as an administrator. To demonstrate that to you, I'm going to delete what I've done. So I'm going to delete this off. So I'm just deleting this web part. And then I'm coming in here and I'm adding a web part in. And And I'm scrolling down and I'm looking for the List View Plus. So I've added the List View Plus to the page, and now it's asking me to configure that. So I come here and I edit, and I'm asked to select a specific data source. Firstly, it asks me to provide a SharePoint URL, so it defaults to the current site, but I can, as I said previously, provide a remote site location. I then select a SharePoint list I want to connect to. So to just demonstrate what I did before, I'm going to select suppliers. Note here I've got options like restricting to a certain default view or controlling the maximum number of items displayed here. I can configure all of those options. I can apply custom CSS to my list, so if I want to present this in a more visual way or use my own corporate colors, I can do. And there's also the idea of a cache. Not so relevant for connecting to a SharePoint list, but maybe when we're connecting to things like the Graph API. The QuizCom apps are designed to load quite quickly, so users get instant results. But maybe if there's certain things which are a little bit slow to load, then it will work off a cache with those items. And the user is able to refresh that cache or clear that cache if it's not showing the most up-to-date information. Okay, so I'm going to come out of that initial data configuration screen, and then we can see our web part built up into a number of different controls. So we've got the table control here, we've got a paging control, and we've got a menu bar control. And we can actually go in here and add other controls, so filter controls, group controls, tabs, or even conditional formatting. I can also change the presentation of individual control. So at the moment that's a table. If I wanted to show it in the list style, I can show it in the list style as well. I can configure each of the settings around these controls. So if we go into the configuring the control for the table, by default, it will have taken the columns from my specific view, so the view I selected when I was connecting to the data source. But if I want to come in here and actually define the columns which I want to include, I can click here and actually say, well, I'd like the supplier name, I'd like the city, and I would like the supplier type. And let's add status as well. And I can change the order of these easily, so I'll move status before supplier type. Actually, let's move it to the second item. And you should be able to see that it's moving those around and positioning them as I want them on screen. I've got various options here to control what happens when I click on an item. So at the moment it's saying select the item, but I can choose to view the item or even call a custom action. Now, custom actions are these options on the right-hand side of each item. So I've got by default view item properties, send an email, open the item in a new window, or edit the item in a new window. I can configure the behavior of each of these, remove them, or even add my own. Now, I don't have an email address in my specific list, so I don't want to use that item action. So I'm going to go in and edit it. And we can configure these actions either from a number of predefined defaults which QuizCom make available to us, or if you've got development skills, then you can write some JavaScript to build these yourselves. I'm not really a developer, so I'm going to remove all of that, and I'm actually going to select from one of the default actions which are available here. So I'm going to go show city and map. Now, by default, this is using a column called city, so I can see that there in the code. I can go and change this if I want to use a different field name if I was using a different field, but I don't need to do that in this case. And at the top here, I've got an icon which is defined for that action. At the moment, it's using the email. I'm going to click on here, and I'm going to search for something which is appropriate to a map. So let's take this one because that's sort of like a map. And once I'm done with that, I just click out of it and I close this control, and then that's configured that map action which we originally saw. So you'll notice it's still saying email item properties, and that's because I didn't actually change the display of that, the tooltip for that one. So let's call it Open Map. So I'm going to close that, and then I'm going to go back to my item, and if I hover over a specific item, you now see it says Open Map. Okay, fantastic. Now let's add some other controls to the screen. So let's say I wanted to display those groupings which we saw before. So if we click on a specific control and go to Insert Control above, I can select what I want to include. So I'm going to add a group. And you can see it picks a specific option for that grouping. And I can configure that grouping in one of two ways. So I can either click on the little settings option and do it in there, or I can do it as if I was a user, but I'm configuring it for all users because I'm an administrator. So I can just drag and drop what I want onto that grouping column and say, well, actually, I want supplier type. And that's immediately configured and ready to use. What else can I add here? I could also add a filter control. So let's go in and add a filter control. And that control is immediately configured with a generic search option. Now, if we don't want the generic search option, we can come into the app and we can turn off the free text filter. So I don't want that in this case. And we can configure other settings for each control as well, such as the headings to use for each of the controls in the menus and stuff like that. And I can quickly go here and either add a new filter or drag and drop a filter on. So I'm just going to go and add a new filter and say I want to filter based on city and status. So now those filters are available. And if I just publish that option, we can now see that my web part's configured in the space of a couple of minutes with options to filter by status, options to filter by city. We can have options to select multiple, and we can even have special parameters like using my login or my name or other things like that. So the basic overview, that's just showing you the List View Plus app, and it's also showing you some of the basics of building up this Lego style UI with different components included. Now, the one which I didn't show you, or the two which I didn't show you in this example, was tabs and conditional formatting, because we'll look at that in the next example. Okay, so List View Plus app. Now let's have a look at the list aggregator. So a lot of the same things apply here, but we're looking at a task list here. So I've got a number of tasks. I can see some are in progress, some are not started, and some are completed. We've got some conditional formatting going on to highlight certain items in red, and we've got the things like the actions as well. Now this specific app is actually connecting to multiple task lists. So we'll see that I've got a task list here which has got 5 tasks in, tasks 1 to 5. But I've also set up a couple of subsites, Project 1 and Project 2. And if I go into one of those, just to show you where our data is coming from, I've got some task list configured in there as well. So this is a task list with a few items in as well. So 3 different task lists across 3 different sites being displayed into a single app with some options around how that's presented. So let me show you how that's configured. I'm going to go off and I'm going to actually delete this web part and just add it again, just to show you how quick and easy it is to build things. So I'm going to go and find my list aggregator app. Now, in the case of the list aggregator, it supports a number of different data sources. So we can connect to an Excel file. So if your data is managed in Excel, but you want to present that using some of the options which the QuizCom apps offer, that Lego style UI, you can do that. We can also connect to the Graph API to connect to things like my recent documents or my tasks from email or something else like that. We can use the SharePoint list aggregator, which is what I'm going to do, which is going to be aggregating data from multiple lists. Or we've got the SharePoint search. These two at the bottom here do largely the same thing. They both aggregate data from SharePoint, but you'll use them for two different use cases. So the list aggregator is more appropriate where you've got a smaller number of lists. They're in one or two site collections, so we can query all that data very quickly and easily, and the configuration is quick. If we want to aggregate hundreds of lists across multiple different site collections, that can become quite an inefficient query. So the SharePoint search option is there when we want to query that data across lots of different sites and site collections, because SharePoint's already done the hard work of indexing all that data. Now, the reason we wouldn't choose that option for more simple scenarios is there's a little bit more work involving an administrator mapping the relevant columns in SharePoint Search. So anyone who's familiar with doing any work with SharePoint Search and doing mapped properties, we have to do all of that sort of thing before we can use the SharePoint Search. So for this example, I'm going to use SharePoint List Aggregator. Again, so firstly, we need to configure what's called the query definition. So this just defines the type of data we're connecting to. We can connect to any list of the type which we want to connect to at this point, so any of the task lists we can use, but it just defines for the list aggregator all the different aspects of that list, the columns, views, and things like that. So I'm going to say I want to connect to a task list, and I'm going to connect to the default view. I could connect to just the My Tasks views if I want to. So that's just defining the type of data I'm going to connect to. At the bottom here, I actually manage my different data sources. So this is where I can go and define one or more sites and lists which I want to aggregate the data from. So I'm going to say my data source is called tasks. Here I can either connect to an entire site collection, specific sites, or specific lists. I'm going to choose the entire site collection. I'm going to start at my current URL, and I can then define different manners around how I want to select the data source I'm going to connect to. I'm going to use a standard list type of tasks, so I know that I want to return all tasks which are created, all tasks from all task lists within this site collection. And I'm going to enable that data source, and you'll have seen straight away that that has then connected to and displayed all of the different tasks from the different sites. So we can see those aggregated there. And because we've got the paging control, we can actually page through the different pages of items, and we can configure that paging control with different restrictions on how many items are displayed within each page. I'm actually thinking for my scenario I don't want to use the paging control, so I'm going to actually switch it to use the tabs control. So over here we can actually just change one of the controls. So I've immediately switched that to a tab-based control, and I can decide it's choosing to use status, but if I wanted to, in the same model with things like groups, I can pick a column and say, well, actually, I'd like to group that by priority. And I can quickly switch through each of those items. I'm going to switch that back to status because I think that's more relevant for what I'm trying to achieve here. Okay, perfect. And then let's look at how we add those conditional formats. So I could do other things like add search controls, those filter controls again to filter the items, but let's look at how we do a conditional format. So I'm going to choose to add the conditional format control, and in here we can just basically add rules for how we want the conditional formatting to appear. So I just click here, add, and I'm going to say, well, actually I want to highlight high priority items in my list. I can click on here to define what the format is going to be. So I can either display an icon, I can color the text, or I can set a background color. I'm going to probably, just so it's most clear to you, I'm going to choose to select a background color. Now at the moment I've got no restrictions around how that's going to be presented, but so it's highlighted everything. I can select how that is going to be applied on the item within the list. So is it going to highlight the entire row, or is it just going to highlight a specific column? Let's choose in this scenario to just highlight the status column. There's a couple of options here to automatically select the item, highlight the item, or even mark it as new. Finally, we apply our conditions. So we say under what circumstances should this be highlighted. So I'm going to say I'm interested in seeing it where the priority is equal to high, and also I don't want to do it for any which are completed. And I'm going to hit save, apply, and then save. And we can see there that I've got a couple of in progress items which are high priority, so I'm just highlighting the status there. And there's an item in not started as well. There's lots of other options which we can do within the conditions. So for instance, if I was to do this based on maybe a due date, then I can use relative options as well. So today is available for me as an option. So I could say items which are past today or items which are coming up within a certain period of time. I can do those sort of things to the filter as well. And so I've got a lot of control over how I apply that conditional formatting. I haven't had to do anything like configure any write any code or anything else like that to apply those. This is all something an end user or a low-level power user can configure on their specific site. The menu bar is configurable as well, so I can come up here and define the different actions. So you can see I've got a selected all, I've got an export all, I've got a delete selected. I can go and add additional actions if I want to and configure those, and QuizCom makes some various options available to me as global actions for me to configure. Okay, so that shows us the list aggregator. It's taking a lot of the principles which we showed with the List View Plus app and then enhancing those by aggregating data. Let's go and have a look at the Calendar Plus app. This has a lot of the same principles as the previous example, but it gives us the ability to present data in a calendar-based format. So here you see I've got various items in a calendar. I can look at those as week, day. Agenda view is also supported. I can filter those as we've seen before, so I could say, oh, I'm interested in items where I've marked the location as on site. And I'm also applying some conditional formatting to those items. So I'm highlighting certain exercise items in yellow, and any ones which have got QuizCom in the subject, I've highlighted in green. So using that conditional formatting which we've seen before. Just to switch into let's just quickly go and show you how this one's configured. So if I come into here and I add the Calendar Plus, I support 3 different data sources. So we can connect to the Graph API, which is what I'm going to show you now. We can connect to a singular SharePoint calendar-based list, or we can connect to the list aggregator, so we could roll up multiple calendars. I'm going to select the Graph API here. And if you know your way around the Graph API or use the Graph Explorer, you can work out the relevant paths and you can start to configure this. To get you started, QuizCom have made various examples available to you within each of the apps. So I'm going to select my calendar. We can see that that's pulling through a specific path in the graph. It's identifying certain columns, and we can apply other advanced filter and additional properties. We can follow through the menu here to configure each of the individual columns, what they're called, the order they come through with, and then each of the data sources of this type will also allow us to map specific columns. So we can say what is the subject column, because we might be connecting to a SharePoint list where it's called something else. What's the location column, body, start dates, etc. So we can map those controls those fields to the controls so they appear correctly within the app. And just like before, I've got a filter control, so I can add additional filters if I wanted to, or change what filters I'm using. And I could add a conditional format, so I can come up here and go add a conditional format. And for instance, I can say I want to highlight in, let's pick a green. I'll select the entire item, and I want to say where the subject contains QuizCom. And there we go. I've just quickly configured it to connect to a calendar and done some really nice conditional formatting. Anyone who's worked with calendars over any period of time realize how frustrating doing that sort of thing is with SharePoint, wherever that data is. This is something which I can connect and configure in a couple of minutes. Okay, so I mentioned this one was my favorite, so the org chart. So thinking about all the principles which we've learned so far about how we connect to different data sources, and we can do filters and conditional formats and other things like that. This is the QuizCom org chart. So here I can see an org chart configured. This is connecting to my data held within Active Directory. I've got the ability to search for people by a specific department or an office location. This org chart's made up of multiple levels. I've set it to be collapsed just below the second level, but I can come in here and I can expand a specific level, collapse a level, see people under those different levels and explore. I can click here to see more about a specific user, so I can go in and I can view their profile and a little card here. See various properties. We can configure social actions as well as Skype calls, email actions as well. Even link off to see the whole of that profile there. I can configure things like assistants, so I've got a personal assistant defined here, and also present certain items in that org chart in different ways. So in this case, this is configured to present it in green. Now to save time, I'm just going to show you how this specific web part has already been configured. So if I come in and edit this, I've got the same sort of options to connect to graph data. So if you look at some of the training videos online, there are examples of connecting that to Excel data or SharePoint list data. So if you haven't got your data in your Active Directory in a format you can use, then you can connect to different data sources. Again, QuizCom make a number of predefined connections to the graph available to you. So I'm using the AD org chart option. And then this goes through and defines the various columns, configures them, and maps them as we've seen before, so those key attributes are mapped in. I've got a conditional format here, which is defining that anyone who's got a job title of personal assistant is presented in that green, and I've also selected that assistant flag. So there's opportunities to present an assistant differently from some of the other presentation options. QuizCom make 3 different org chart controls available to us. So we're looking at one of those, just to flick through the different ones so you can see some of the different presentations. So that's one of the options available to you. Here's another, and then returning finally to the original option which I displayed to you. We can actually go and configure that control and define various settings. So we can say the number of levels we want to open by default. So let's say I want to actually open all of the levels by default. I can do that. I can configure things like the height of the control, so maybe I need a bit more space. Things like orientation, and also things like the controls and how they're presented. So I can say, well, actually, I want to use the grey look for those. So that's presented slightly differently. And I can even define how an assistant is displayed differently. So let's say we want to display that as a circle. Yeah. And even you get scenarios where people want to highlight or call out a specific person in the org chart. We could do that with conditional formatting. Alternatively, we can just come here and edit this option and select a specific layout for a specific person and change their layout within the org chart as well. So really configurable in terms of defining how everything is presented, different org chart controls, and also using conditional formatting and doing all the things like applying filters to be able to search for people in that org chart as well. Okay, so quickly before we wrap up, I also wanted to talk about the Data View Plus. So the Data View Plus is the combination of everything else which I've shown you. I've got an example here of connecting to my recent files. So if we come into this example, we can connect to all of the different data sources. So we can connect to Excel files, the Graph API, SharePoint lists, etc. There's more graph examples here. So in this case, I'm connecting to my recent files, so showing me all of my recent files from across OneDrive and SharePoint Online. Dependent on the option I've selected, I'll get different configuration options in terms of how it's how I'm configuring the various attributes. And finally, I've got the opportunity at the end here to control how that information is presented. So what type of data is that? So that's how we can then manage and say, well, actually, this is list data, or this is a calendar, or this is an org chart. So basically, it's an all-in-one complete package for connecting to different data sources and displaying it using all of the different techniques I've shown you. And of course, we can build up this control with those same building blocks in the Lego style UI, which we've seen previously. Finally, I just wanted to point this out. So there's the opportunity, if you've got developers and you need more advanced scenarios, or you'd like support from Quizcom in terms of delivering a more advanced scenario, how data is presented, we can use what's called custom controls. Now, these are only available with the Data View Plus app, and they allow us to present data in pretty much any format we want by writing a custom control using Knockout. This is connecting to a SharePoint list called risks, and dependent on where the item is within that list in terms of its classification of probability versus severity, it will place it in a different location on this custom control, which I can then hover over and see the data. Just to briefly show you, I've got this SharePoint list which it's connecting to, and I'm defining a probability and severity, which will define where it sits on this control. So that's perhaps for the more development-minded people. But even if you're not a developer, but you have a specific way you want to present data, then Quizcom can still help you in terms of building and configuring that control. Okay, so just returning to PowerPoint to summarize, and then we'll have an opportunity for any questions. In summary, these Quizcom apps let you easily connect to a variety of different data sources. I've shown you some SharePoint list examples, either singular lists or multiple lists. We can leverage that power of the Graph API. So Microsoft have made that Graph API available to connect to all sorts of data across SharePoint, Exchange, and the other Office 365 data sources. We can really easily customize this data using this Lego style UI, building up those different controls to present the data however you want to. The apps themselves are available individually, so I went through and showed you the different apps, the List View Plus, the List Aggregator, the Calendar Plus, and the org chart. But if you want that sort of complete set of tools, if you know you're going to build use a series of different apps to present lots of different data, then look at the Data View Plus. If you're going to use more than or more than one of those apps, you just need to use a couple of those apps. Price-wise, the Data View Plus is the way to go. And if you want to, you can extend things either with custom controls or custom actions in terms of enhancing and delivering a very specific experience for what you're looking for. Thank you for watching this webinar recording. If you'd like to find out more about the QuizCom apps or access free trials, please contact QuizCom using the details on screen.